The crack of a leather belt against flesh tore through the stillness of the Wyoming night, followed by a woman's muffled cry. Florence Sutton clutched her newborn daughter to her chest, her body trembling as her husband Frank loomed over her, his face contorted with drunken rage. A girl. He spat, swaying slightly as he raised the belt again. 9 months of waiting for a worthless girl. The year was 1875, and the small homestead outside Laramie, Wyoming territory, had become Florence's prison rather than the dream home Frank had promised when they'd married 3 years earlier. At 23, Florence had already endured more suffering than many women twice her age. "Please, Frank," she begged, turning to shield the infant. "She's just a baby, our baby." "What good is a girl out here?" Frank snarled, bringing the belt down again, catching Florence across the shoulder. "Can't work the land, can't hunt, just another mouth to feed," the baby wailed, her tiny face red with distress, sensing her mother's fear. Florence's golden hair fell across her tear-streaked face as she rocked her daughter, desperately trying to calm her. "I needed a son." Frank shouted, kicking over a chair. The whiskey bottle in his hand sloshed as he took another long pull. "You couldn't even give me that?" Outside, the wind howled across the prairie, carrying the sounds of the confrontation into the cold spring night. No neighbors for miles to hear Florence's cries, no one to intervene. Frank raised his hand again, but a sudden pounding on the door made him pause. "Sutton, you in there?" a deep voice called from outside. Frank cursed, stumbling toward the door, yanking it open to reveal a tall man silhouetted against the night sky. Even in the dim light of the oil lamp, Florence could see the star pinned to the visitor's coat. "Sheriff Elliott Whitaker," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "Heard some commotion passing by. Everything all right here?" Elliott stepped into the cabin, his eyes quickly taking in the scene: the overturned furniture, Florence's bruised face, the wailing infant, and Frank's aggressive stance. At 30 years old, Elliott had seen plenty of ugly situations in his 5 years as sheriff, but the sight before him made his blood boil. "Just a family matter," Frank slurred, trying to block the sheriff's view. "Wife just had a baby, we're celebrating." "That's so?" Elliott asked, his gaze shifting to Florence cowering in the corner. "Madam, you and the little one okay?" Florence opened her mouth to speak, but Frank cut her off. "She's fine." "We're all fine, just disappointed is all. Wanted a boy, got stuck with a girl instead." Elliott's jaw tightened as he noted the red marks forming on Florence's arms and the fear in her eyes. "Looks to me like you're taking that disappointment out on your wife, Sutton," Frank sneered. "What I do with my wife is my business, Sheriff. Not when it involves breaking the law." Elliott's hand moved to rest on his holstered revolver. "I think you'd better come with me, let things cool down." "You can't arrest a man for disciplining his own family," Frank protested, his face reddening. "I can arrest a man for assault," Elliott replied evenly. "And that's what this looks like to me." Frank lunged suddenly, swinging the whiskey bottle at Elliott's head. The sheriff ducked, the bottle shattering against the wall behind him. In one swift motion, Elliott had Frank pinned against the rough-hewn cabin wall, wrists being bound with iron cuffs. "Frank Sutton, you're under arrest for assault and attempting to assault an officer of the law." Florence watched in shock as the sheriff subdued her husband. For 3 years, Frank's temper had grown worse, the beatings more frequent. No one had ever intervened before. As Elliott led Frank toward the door, he paused, looking back at Florence. "Madam, is there someone I can send for? Someone to stay with you tonight?" Florence shook her head, wiping tears with her free hand while cradling her daughter. "No, sir. We're new to these parts." "Don't know anyone well enough." Elliott frowned. "I'll have Doc Peterson come check on you and the baby once I get this one locked up." He glanced at the infant, now quieting in her mother's arms. "How old is she?" "Just born yesterday," Florence whispered. "Frank was out celebrating. Just came home tonight and saw her." Elliott's expression softened as he looked at the tiny bundle. "She's perfect," he said quietly. "Just like her mother." The simple kindness in his words brought fresh tears to Florence's eyes. No one had spoken to her that gently in years. "I'll be back soon." Elliott promised, nudging Frank toward the door. "Lock up behind us." After they left, Florence carefully placed her daughter in the handmade cradle beside their bed and moved to secure the door. Her entire body ached from the beating and the recent childbirth. She hadn't named the baby, yet Frank had been so certain they would have a boy that they'd only discussed male names. "Sarah," she whispered, returning to stroke her daughter's soft cheek. "Sarah Elizabeth Sutton." The name had been her grandmother's, a woman of remarkable strength who had crossed the Oregon Trail and helped establish a homestead when Florence was just a child. True to his word, Elliott returned an hour later with the town doctor, Dr. Peterson, a kindly older man with silver hair and gentle hands, examined both Florence and the baby by lamplight. "The little one's healthy as can be," he proclaimed, smiling as he swaddled Sarah back up. "Good strong lungs. You did well, Mrs. Sutton." He turned his attention to Florence, clucking his tongue as he treated the cuts and bruises. "These will heal," he said, applying a salve to the worst of them. "But I worry about what happens when your husband returns home." Florence looked down, unable to meet his eyes. "He's never been this bad before. The first assault is rarely the last, my dear," Dr. Peterson said gently, "and they typically get worse, not better." "Frank's going to be in my jail for at least a week," Elliott said from where he stood by the door. "Gives you some time to think about what you want to do next." "Do next," Florence echoed, bewildered. "Some women in your situation choose to return to family," Dr. Peterson explained. "Others find different paths." Florence laughed bitterly. "My family's back in Missouri. I have no money, a newborn child, and a homestead. I can't work alone." She shook her head. "What choice do I have?" After the doctor left, Elliott remained, awkwardly shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Mrs. Sutton, I don't mean to overstep, but I'd be happy to look in on you over the next few days. Make sure you have what you need." "Why would you do that?" she asked, genuine confusion in her voice. Elliott removed his hat, revealing thick brown hair that curled slightly at his temples. His blue eyes held a sincerity that caught Florence off guard. "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered simply. "No woman should have to face what you're facing alone." Over the next week, Elliott was true to his word. Each day he rode out to the Sutton homestead, bringing supplies: milk, bread, dried meat, even toys for the baby that he'd carved himself. He chopped wood for Florence's stove, repaired a leaky section of roof, and checked on the 2 horses and small collection of chickens that comprised the Sutton livestock. On the 3rd day, while Elliott was repairing the porch steps that had begun to rot, Florence brought him a cup of coffee and stood watching him work, Sarah sleeping peacefully in a sling across her chest. "Sheriff Whitaker," she began hesitantly. "Elliott," he corrected with a smile. "After all this, I think we can dispense with formalities." "Elliott," she amended, returning his smile tentatively. "I keep wondering why you're doing all this. Surely the sheriff of Laramie has more important matters to attend to than helping a woman he barely knows." Elliott set down his hammer and accepted the coffee. "My mother was in a situation similar to yours," he said after taking a sip. "My father was a mean drunk, beat her regular, especially after I was born, said she'd given him a weakling for a son." Florence's eyes widened. "I'm sorry." Elliott shrugged. "Don't be. One night when I was 6, she packed our things while he was passed out drunk. We left Missouri and headed west, ended up here in Wyoming territory. She worked as a seamstress, raised me on her own." His expression grew distant. "She died of tuberculosis when I was 17, but she was the strongest person I ever knew." "She sounds remarkable," Florence said softly. "She was." Elliott's eyes refocused on Florence. "So when I see a woman being mistreated by her husband, especially over something as beautiful as bringing a child into this world, well, I can't just look the other way." Florence blinked back tears. "Frank wasn't always like this. When we married, he was kind, ambitious. Said we'd build a good life here, but the land's been harder than he expected. The drinking started last winter, then the anger." "Hardship reveals a man's true character," Elliott observed. "It doesn't create it." They fell silent, the only sounds the distant call of meadowlarks and Sarah's soft breathing. "What will you do when he's released?" Elliott finally asked, the question they'd both been avoiding. Florence sighed, looking out over the rolling prairie that surrounded their small homestead. "I don't know," she admitted. "This land is half mine by law. I've put my sweat and tears into it, but staying means—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. "It means putting yourself and Sarah at risk," Elliott finished for her. "Frank's been telling everyone in town who'll listen that he's going to teach you proper respect when he gets out." Fear flickered across Florence's face. "He said that?" Elliott nodded grimly. "I can keep him locked up on the current charges for another few days at most. After that—" He hesitated. "Florence, I need to be honest with you. I don't think you should be here when he returns." That night, after Elliott had gone, Florence sat by the window, rocking Sarah and contemplating her options. She could try to work the homestead alone, but even if she had the strength and knowledge, Frank would eventually return. She could attempt to sell her half of the property, but no one would buy land with such a complicated situation attached. She could go back to Missouri, to her aging parents who had barely scraped by themselves and had warned her against marrying Frank in the first place. The thought of their disappointed faces, their "we told you so" expressions, made her stomach tighten. As dawn broke over the eastern horizon, Florence made her decision. She would not be waiting when Frank returned. She would take Sarah and whatever she could carry and leave Laramie behind. Where she would go, she wasn't certain, but anywhere would be better than remaining under Frank's violent hand. When Elliott arrived that morning, Florence was already packing a small trunk with clothes and the few possessions she couldn't bear to leave behind. "You're leaving," he observed, leaning against the doorframe. "Yes," she confirmed, folding a dress into the trunk. "Though I haven't figured out where to yet, or how, for that matter. Frank has the only wagon and it's in town where he left it before." She gestured vaguely to her healing bruises. Elliott removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "I have a proposition for you, Mrs. Sutton." "Florence." She looked up, curious. "My deputy's brother runs a stage coach line. There's a coach leaving for Cheyenne tomorrow morning. From there, you could take the train east if you wanted to." "That's very kind, but I can't afford a stage coach ticket, let alone a train journey." "I've already spoken to him. The ticket is taken care of." Florence straightened, her pride flaring. "I won't accept charity, Sheriff." "Not charity," Elliott corrected. "Consider it an advance. There's a position open in Cheyenne that might suit you. The territorial governor's wife is looking for a companion and nanny for their children. It's a respectable position with room and board provided. The governor's residence is one of the finest in the territory." Florence stared at him in disbelief. "How do you know about such a position?" "The governor and I served together briefly during the war. We've maintained a correspondence. When I telegraphed him about your situation, he spoke with his wife. She's willing to meet with you." For the first time since Sarah's birth, a flicker of hope sparked in Florence's heart. A position in the governor's household would provide safety, stability, and a fresh start for her and Sarah. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. Elliott smiled, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Just promise me you'll give yourself and that beautiful daughter of yours the chance at a better life." "I promise," Florence whispered. The next morning, Elliott arrived at the homestead with his own wagon to transport Florence, Sarah, and their belongings to town. As they loaded the trunk and a few small bags, Florence took a final look at the cabin she had called home for 3 years. Despite everything, a pang of regret shot through her. This was supposed to have been where she built her life, raised her children, grew old with a loving husband. "Having second thoughts?" Elliott asked gently, noticing her hesitation. Florence squared her shoulders. "No. Just saying goodbye to a dream that wasn't meant to be." They reached Laramie with time to spare before the stagecoach departure. Elliott insisted on treating Florence to breakfast at the hotel restaurant, one of the few establishments in town that catered to women as well as men. As they ate, Florence became aware of the curious stares from other patrons. A young mother dining with the sheriff was apparently cause for speculation in a town the size of Laramie. "People are watching us," she murmured, uncomfortable under their scrutiny. Elliott glanced around, then shrugged. "Let them, you've done nothing wrong." "What about Frank? Won't he hear about this when he's released?" "Frank Sutton would do well to forget he ever knew you," Elliott said, his voice suddenly hard. "I've made it clear to him what will happen if he tries to follow you." The intensity in his eyes startled Florence. "You shouldn't make enemies on my account." "Some enemies are worth making," Elliott's expression softened. "Besides, Frank Sutton is the type of man who picks on those weaker than himself. He won't come looking for a fair fight." After breakfast, they made their way to the stage coach office. The coach was already waiting, a sturdy Concorde model pulled by 6 horses, with luggage being loaded on top. A few other passengers milled about, including a well-dressed older couple and a young man who appeared to be a traveling salesman. The driver, a weathered man with a thick mustache, approached them. "Sheriff," he greeted Elliott with a nod. "This the lady you mentioned, Mrs. Florence Sutton," Elliott confirmed, "and her daughter Sarah." The driver tipped his hat to Florence. "Madam, we've got you a good seat inside, not too bumpy. Should reach Cheyenne by nightfall if the weather holds." As the departure time drew near, an awkwardness fell between Florence and Elliott. There was so much to say, yet neither seemed able to find the right words. "I can never repay you for your kindness," Florence finally said, cradling Sarah against her shoulder. "There's nothing to repay," Elliott assured her. "Just write occasionally, let me know how you and the little one are faring." "I will," she promised. The driver called for passengers to board. Elliott helped Florence up the step into the coach, then handed her a small package. "What's this?" she asked. "Just some provisions for the journey." "And a little something for Sarah." Inside the package, Florence found bread, cheese, dried apple slices, and a small wooden horse beautifully carved. "Did you make this?" she asked, holding up the toy. Elliott nodded, a slight blush coloring his cheeks. "Something to remember Laramie by." "We won't forget," Florence said softly. "We won't forget you." The driver climbed up to his seat and took the reins. With a sharp whistle and a crack of the whip, the horses lurched forward and the stagecoach began to roll out of town. Florence leaned out the window, watching Elliott grow smaller as the distance between them increased. He stood in the street, hat in hand, until the coach turned a bend in the road and he disappeared from view. The journey to Cheyenne was long and uncomfortable. The coach bounced mercilessly over the rough terrain, and despite the driver's promise about her seat, Florence felt every jolt. Sarah, surprisingly, seemed to enjoy the motion, sleeping contentedly for much of the trip. The older couple seated across from Florence introduced themselves as Mr. and Mrs. Buchanan, merchants from Denver visiting their daughter in Cheyenne. Mrs. Buchanan, a plump, motherly woman with kind eyes, immediately took to Sarah, offering to hold her when Florence needed to rest. "Such a beautiful child," Mrs. Buchanan cooed, gently bouncing Sarah on her knee. "How old is she?" "Just over a week," Florence replied, grateful for the momentary reprieve. Mrs. Buchanan's eyebrows rose. "My goodness, you shouldn't be traveling so soon after childbirth." "Where is your husband, dear?" Florence hesitated, uncertain how to respond. The traveling salesman, who had introduced himself as Harold Jenkins, saved her from answering. "Some questions are best left unasked, Mrs. Buchanan," he said tactfully. "Not every lady's circumstances are for public discussion." Mrs. Buchanan flushed, immediately contrite. "Oh, I do apologize, Mrs. Sutton. I didn't mean to pry." "No offense taken," Florence assured her, grateful for Mr. Jenkins' intervention. As the day wore on, the travelers shared their food and stories. Florence found herself relaxing slightly, enjoying this brief companionship before facing the uncertainties that awaited her in Cheyenne. They arrived in Cheyenne just as dusk was falling, the coach pulling up outside the Cheyenne House Hotel. Florence gathered her things, her stomach fluttering with nerves. Elliott had arranged for her to stay at the hotel overnight, with her interview at the governor's residence scheduled for the following morning. After bidding farewell to her fellow travelers, Florence checked into the hotel, a modest but clean establishment. The room was small but comfortable, with a bed that felt luxurious after the jarring coach ride. She fed Sarah, bathed her with water from the pitcher, and settled her into a makeshift bed created from a drawer padded with blankets. Sleep eluded Florence that night. She lay awake, thoughts churning. What if the governor's wife didn't like her? What if she couldn't perform the duties required? What if Frank somehow found them? And beneath all these worries, thoughts of Elliott kept surfacing: his kindness, his gentle strength, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. Morning came too quickly. Florence, dressed in her best gown, a blue calico with only one mended tear, and prepared Sarah for their important meeting. A carriage sent by the governor arrived promptly at 10 o'clock, driven by a uniformed man who treated Florence with surprising deference. The territorial governor's residence was the grandest building Florence had ever seen, a stately two-story structure with wide verandas and immaculately maintained grounds. As the carriage pulled up to the entrance, Florence's courage nearly failed her. What place did a farmer's wife from a failing homestead have in such surroundings? The door opened before they reached it, and a tall, elegant woman stepped out to greet them. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with dark hair streaked with silver and an air of quiet authority. "Mrs. Sutton?" she inquired, her voice cultured but warm. "I'm Margaret Thayer, the governor's wife. Please come in." Inside, the residence was as impressive as its exterior suggested, with polished wooden floors, fine furniture, and artwork adorning the walls. Mrs. Thayer led Florence to a sunny parlor where tea had been laid out. "Sheriff Whitaker spoke very highly of you in his telegram," Mrs. Thayer said as she poured tea. "He mentioned you're recently widowed." Florence nearly choked on her first sip. "Widowed?" Mrs. Thayer looked confused. "Yes, the sheriff indicated you had lost your husband shortly after your daughter's birth." "Was that incorrect?" Florence hesitated only briefly before nodding. "Yes, that's right. It was very sudden." She felt a twinge of guilt at the lie, but understood Elliott's wisdom. A widow with a child would face far less judgment than a woman who had fled her husband, and in a way her marriage was indeed dead. "I'm very sorry for your loss," Mrs. Thayer said sympathetically. "It must be difficult, especially with a newborn." "Thank you," Florence murmured. "We're managing as best we can." "Well, let me tell you about the position," Mrs. Thayer continued. "The governor and I have 3 children. William is 12, Eleanor is 9, and James is 6. They're generally well behaved, though like all children, they have their moments." She smiled fondly. "We need someone to oversee their education, accompany them on outings, and generally ensure they're where they need to be when they need to be there. The position includes private quarters for you and your daughter, all meals, and a monthly wage of $20. Florence tried not to show her shock at the generous offer. $20 a month was more than many men earned in the territories, and with room and board provided, she could save almost all of it. "I should mention," Mrs. Thayer added, "that we travel occasionally to Washington and other eastern cities. The position would require you to accompany the family on these journeys." "I understand," Florence said, though the thought of such travel was both exciting and terrifying. "Now, Mrs. Thayer said, setting down her teacup, "Tell me about yourself, Mrs. Sutton. Sheriff Whitaker mentioned you're educated?" "I attended school until I was 16, Florence confirmed. "My father believed in education for both his sons and daughters. I'm comfortable with arithmetic, literature, history, and basic sciences. I also play the piano, though it's been some time since I've had access to an instrument." Mrs. Thayer nodded approvingly. "And you've worked with children before?" "I helped raise my younger siblings," Florence said. "And I taught at our local school for a year before my marriage." The interview continued pleasantly, with Mrs. Thayer asking thoughtful questions about Florence's background and experiences. Sarah remained remarkably calm throughout, sleeping in Florence's arms until near the end of their conversation when she woke with a hungry cry. "Oh, you poor dear," Mrs. Thayer said, not to Florence but to Sarah. "You've been so patient. Perhaps you'd like to feed her. There's a small sitting room through that door that would afford you some privacy." Florence gratefully accepted the offer, retreating to nurse Sarah. When she returned, Mrs. Thayer was standing by the window, gazing out at the garden. "She's a beautiful child," Mrs. Thayer observed. "What's her name?" Sarah Elizabeth, Florence replied. "A lovely name." Mrs. Thayer turned to face Florence fully. "Mrs. Sutton, I won't keep you in suspense. I'd like to offer you the position. You seem perfectly suited to our needs, and I believe you and Sarah would be a wonderful addition to our household." Relief and gratitude flooded through Florence. "Thank you, Mrs. Thayer. We would be honored to accept." "Excellent. When can you start?" "I understand you might need time to settle your affairs." "I have very few affairs to settle," Florence admitted. "We could begin immediately if that suits you." "Wonderful. I'll have your quarters prepared today. You can move in tomorrow morning." As Florence left the governor's residence, Sarah sleeping contentedly against her shoulder, she felt as though a great weight had been lifted from her. For the first time since Frank's attack, she could see a path forward, not just survival, but perhaps eventually happiness. Back at the hotel, Florence wrote 2 letters. The first was to her parents in Missouri, informing them of her widowhood and new position. She couldn't bring herself to tell them the truth about Frank, knowing it would only confirm their worst fears about her marriage. The second letter was to Elliott. In it, she thanked him for his kindness and intervention, told him about her successful interview, and promised to write again once she was settled. She hesitated over the closing, finally settling on with deepest gratitude, Florence and Sarah Sutton. She sealed both letters, entrusting them to the hotel clerk for mailing, then returned to her room to prepare for the new life that awaited them. The following 6 months passed in a blur of activity as Florence settled into her role at the governor's residence. The children, initially wary of their new governess, quickly warmed to her gentle but firm approach. Young James, in particular, became devoted to Florence, following her around like a shadow when his lessons were complete. Sarah thrived in their new environment, growing strong and healthy. She began to smile responsively at 6 weeks, bringing joy to everyone in the household. Even the governor, a serious man often preoccupied with territorial affairs, would stop to peek at Sarah when he thought no one was watching. True to her word, Florence wrote to Elliott regularly, sharing stories of Sarah's developments and her experiences in the Thayer household. His responses came just as faithfully, filled with news of Laramie and observations about his work as sheriff. In one letter, sent 3 months after her departure, Elliott included information that both relieved and troubled Florence. Frank Sutton has left Laramie. After his release, he returned to the homestead only to find it abandoned. He came to town in a rage, demanding to know your whereabouts. When I refused to tell him, he attempted to start a fight in the saloon. Several men who had heard about his treatment of you intervened. The next morning, he sold the homestead for far less than its worth to a cattle rancher named Peterson and boarded the eastbound stage. I believe he's returned to Missouri, though I cannot say for certain. I tell you this not to cause you distress, but so you can be at ease knowing he is no longer in Wyoming territory. Florence read this passage several times, relief mingling with sadness for what might have been. The homestead had represented her dreams of a happy family life in the West. Now it belonged to strangers. In November, the Thayer family made their first journey with Florence, traveling to Denver for a political convention. The train journey fascinated Sarah, now 5 months old, who stared wide-eyed at the passing landscape and charmed fellow passengers with her ready smile. Denver was larger and more developed than any city Florence had seen. The streets bustled with activity, shops displayed goods from all over the country, and the hotels rivaled those in eastern cities for luxury and service. While Governor Thayer attended political meetings, Mrs. Thayer took Florence and the children sightseeing. They visited shops, attended a theatrical performance suitable for the children, and dined in restaurants where the waiters wore formal attire and addressed even young William as Sir. On their third evening in Denver, while the children were being entertained by a cousin of Mrs. Thayer's who lived in the city, Florence accompanied Mrs. Thayer to a reception at the home of a prominent Denver businessman. "It will do you good to meet some people your own age," Mrs. Thayer insisted when Florence protested that she should stay with Sarah. "My niece's nanny is perfectly capable of watching the baby for a few hours." Florence reluctantly agreed, donning a borrowed evening gown of Mrs. Thayer's that had been hastily altered to fit her slimmer frame. The deep burgundy silk made her feel both elegant and conspicuous as they entered the businessman's mansion. The reception was grander than any social event Florence had ever attended. Crystal chandeliers illuminated rooms filled with Denver's elite, all dressed in their finest attire. An orchestra played in the ballroom where couples waltzed across a polished floor. "Margaret," a booming voice called out as they entered the main hall. A tall man with an impressive mustache approached, a glass of champagne in hand. "How delightful to see you, and who is your lovely companion?" "Charles, may I present Mrs. Florence Sutton, governess to our children. Florence, this is Charles Barrington, our host and one of Denver's most successful bankers." Florence curtsied slightly. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Barrington. Your home is magnificent." "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Sutton. Any friend of the Thayers is welcome here. Please enjoy the festivities. There are refreshments in the dining room and dancing in the ballroom." As the evening progressed, Florence found herself enjoying the elegant surroundings and lively conversation more than she had anticipated. Several gentlemen asked her to dance, and while she declined most invitations out of loyalty to her late husband, she did accept one dance with an elderly judge who reminded her of her grandfather. She was returning from the refreshment room with a glass of punch when a familiar figure across the room caught her attention. Tall and broad-shouldered, with that same curly brown hair at his temples. "Elliott," she whispered, nearly spilling her punch. As if hearing her, the man turned, and Florence felt her heart skip. It was indeed Elliott Whitaker, looking remarkably different in formal attire instead of his sheriff's clothing. He spotted her at the same moment, his expression changing from casual interest to shock and then delight. He made his way through the crowd toward her, stopping a respectful distance away. "Mrs. Sutton," he greeted her formally, though his eyes conveyed a warmth that formal words could not. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Sheriff Whitaker," she returned, suddenly conscious of her borrowed dress and styled hair. "I didn't expect to see you in Denver. The territorial governors are meeting about a unified approach to railroad regulations," Elliott explained. "All the county sheriffs were invited to provide input on security measures." He glanced around the crowded room. "Though I admit this type of gathering isn't my usual environment." "Nor mine," Florence confessed with a small smile. "You look well," Elliott said, his gaze taking in her appearance. "Very well, in fact." Florence felt a blush rising to her cheeks. "Thank you. The position with the Thayers has been a blessing for Sarah and me." "And how is the little one?" Elliott asked, genuine interest in his voice. "Thriving. She's growing so quickly." She started to reach for things now, and her laugh. Florence trailed off, realizing she was gushing. "I'm sorry, I don't mean to bore you with baby stories." "You could never bore me, Florence," Elliott said softly, the use of her first name sending a pleasant shiver through her. Before she could respond, the orchestra began a new waltz, the beautiful strains of music filling the ballroom. "Would you do me the honor of dancing with me?" Elliott asked, offering his hand. Florence hesitated only briefly before placing her hand in his. "I'd be delighted." As Elliott led her onto the dance floor, a curious lightness filled Florence's chest. His hand at her waist was strong yet gentle, guiding her through the steps of the waltz with surprising grace for a man more accustomed to riding horses than dancing at society balls. I didn't know sheriffs were taught to dance, she teased as they turned in perfect time to the music. Elliott grinned, the expression transforming his usually serious face. My mother insisted, said even lawmen should know how to behave in civilized company. She was a wise woman. She would have liked you, Elliott said thoughtfully. You have the same quiet strength. They continued dancing, conversation flowing easily between them as though the 6 months of separation had been merely days. Florence found herself laughing at Elliott's dry observations about the other guests and his tales of the journey from Laramie to Denver. When the dance ended, neither seemed eager to part company. Elliott escorted Florence to a relatively quiet corner of the ballroom where they continued talking, oblivious to the curious glances from other guests. How long will you be in Denver? Florence asked, hoping her eagerness didn't show too plainly in her voice. The conference ends tomorrow, Elliott replied, a note of regret evident. I'll be returning to Laramie the following day, and you, the governor has meetings for another 3 days, will return to Cheyenne after that. Elliott nodded, his expression thoughtful. Florence, would you consider? That is, if you're not otherwise engaged. Would you allow me to call on you tomorrow evening? Perhaps we could take supper together. The formal invitation, so properly delivered, made Florence smile. I would enjoy that very much, Elliott. They arranged to meet at 6 o'clock the following evening, Elliott promising to find a suitable restaurant not far from the hotel where the Thayers were staying. As they parted company for the night, he raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that was both old-fashioned and deeply moving. Until tomorrow, he murmured. Florence returned to her hotel room in a daze, her thoughts filled with Elliott. She had not expected to see him again, certainly not in such circumstances. And she had definitely not expected the leap of joy she'd felt at the sight of him, or the comfort of his presence as they danced. After checking on a sleeping Sarah and changing out of the borrowed gown, Florence lay awake, trying to make sense of her feelings. Frank had been out of her life for only 6 months. Was it disloyal to feel this attraction to another man? Or was it natural, given that her marriage had been effectively over long before she left Laramie? The next evening, Florence took extra care with her appearance, selecting a simpler but still elegant dress from her own limited wardrobe. Mrs. Thayer, intuiting something of Florence's excitement, insisted on watching Sarah herself. Young women need evenings out occasionally, she said with a knowing smile. Especially young women who work as hard as you do. Enjoy your supper with the sheriff. Florence was waiting in the hotel lobby at 6 o'clock sharp when Elliott arrived. He had traded his formal attire from the previous night for a clean, well-cut suit that emphasized his broad shoulders and tall frame. His hat was in his hands, his hair neatly combed, and Florence felt a flutter of something that went beyond simple attraction. You look beautiful, Elliott said by way of greeting. Thank you, Florence replied, accepting his offered arm. You look quite handsome yourself. Elliott led her to a restaurant 2 blocks from the hotel, a comfortable establishment that struck the perfect balance between elegant and casual. The host clearly recognized Elliott, greeting him by name and leading them to a quiet table near a window overlooking the street. I had no idea you were so well known in Denver, Florence remarked as they were seated. Elliott looked sheepish. The host is my cousin's husband. I may have asked him for a particularly nice table when I made the reservation this morning. The admission charmed Florence. You went to a lot of trouble. It's no trouble at all, Elliott assured her, his blue eyes meeting hers across the table. I've thought about you often these past months, Florence. Your letters have been a bright spot in my weeks. As have yours in mine, she admitted. They ordered dinner, roast beef for Elliott, chicken for Florence, and a bottle of wine to share. As they ate, their conversation deepened, moving beyond the pleasantries and general news they had exchanged in their letters. Elliott spoke of his childhood in Missouri, of his mother's struggle to raise him alone after they fled his father, of his decision to become a lawman after witnessing an injustice in his youth. Florence, in turn, shared stories of her own childhood, her brief teaching career, and her initial hopes for her marriage to Frank. "I thought I knew him," she said, staring into her wine glass. "We courted for nearly a year before marrying. He was charming, ambitious, promised me the world." "Men like that are good at hiding their true nature," Elliott observed, "until they believe they have ownership, not partnership." "Yes," Florence agreed. "That's exactly what happened. After the wedding, everything changed slowly at first, then all at once." "You're well rid of him," Elliott said firmly. Florence nodded, looking up to meet his gaze. "I know, I don't regret leaving. I only regret not doing it sooner." She hesitated, then added softly, "And I'm grateful every day that you happened to pass by our homestead that night." Elliott reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "So am I." The touch of his hand on hers sent warmth spreading up Florence's arm. Neither moved for a long moment, the simple contact saying more than words could express. When their dessert arrived, a shared slice of apple pie, Elliott reluctantly withdrew his hand, but his eyes remained fixed on Florence's face. "I have a confession to make," he said, as they finished the last bites of pie. "I didn't just happen to be passing by your homestead that night." Florence looked at him in surprise. "What do you mean?" Elliott ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of his discomfort. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins, came to town that morning. She told me she'd heard shouting from your place several times in recent weeks. Said she was worried about you but didn't know what to do." "Mrs. Jenkins," Florence echoed in disbelief. "Her farm is 3 miles from ours. I barely knew her." "Distance doesn't stop sound carrying on the prairie," Elliott pointed out, "and she had good ears and a kind heart. She asked me to check on you, but to be discreet about it. Said her husband and Frank sometimes drank together, and she didn't want to cause trouble between them." Florence absorbed this information, thinking of the older woman who had sometimes waved to her from a distance but whom she'd spoken to perhaps twice in 3 years. "So you came because of her concern?" Elliott nodded. "I'd been meaning to ride out anyway." There had been rumors about Frank's behavior when he was in town, but Mrs. Jenkins' visit gave me the push I needed. His expression darkened. "Thank God I didn't wait any longer." "Thank God indeed," Florence murmured, thinking of what might have happened if Elliott hadn't intervened that night. After dinner, they walked slowly back toward Florence's hotel, the streets of Denver still busy with evening activity. Elliott kept her hand tucked into the crook of his arm, his solid presence beside her a comfort in the unfamiliar city. "When will you return to Laramie?" Florence asked as they approached the hotel. "My train leaves at noon tomorrow," Elliott replied. "I need to get back. My deputy is capable, but there's been trouble with cattle rustlers recently." Florence nodded, fighting back disappointment. Their brief reunion would end all too soon. At the hotel entrance, they paused, reluctant to say goodbye. "Florence," Elliott began, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "I don't know when we'll have another chance to meet, but I want you to know. These past months, your letters, seeing you again. They've meant more to me than I can properly express." "They've meant a great deal to me as well," Florence admitted, her heart pounding. Elliott took a deep breath, as if gathering courage. "I find myself thinking about you throughout my days. About you and Sarah and the kind of life you deserve to have." He took her hands in his expression earnest. "I know it's too soon, that you're still healing from what happened with Frank, but I want you to know that I care for you deeply." Florence felt tears pricking at her eyes. "Elliott." "You don't need to say anything," he assured her quickly. "I understand if you're not ready or if you don't feel the same way. I just couldn't let this opportunity pass without telling you." Florence squeezed his hands. "I do feel the same way," she said softly. "I've tried to tell myself it's too soon, that I shouldn't trust these feelings after what happened with Frank, but I can't deny what's in my heart." Relief and joy flooded Elliott's face. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to withdraw, he leaned down and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief, tender, a promise rather than a demand. When they parted, Florence felt a certainty she hadn't experienced in years. This man, with his quiet strength and unwavering integrity, was someone she could trust with her heart and with Sarah's future. "Write to me," Elliott said as they finally prepared to part, "and know that I'll be thinking of you every day until we meet again." "I will," Florence promised. "Be safe, Elliott." With one last lingering look, Elliott turned and walked away, his tall figure eventually disappearing into the Denver night. Florence watched until he was gone, then entered the hotel, her lips still tingling from his kiss, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Over the next several months, Florence and Elliott's correspondence deepened. Their letters, once friendly and informative, now contained expressions of affection and longing. Elliott described his work in Laramie, the progress of the town, the challenges of enforcing the law in a growing community. Florence wrote about Sarah's developments, her first tooth, her attempts to crawl, her delight in the world around her. In April, 7 months after their meeting in Denver, Elliott's letter contained news that made Florence's heart race. "I've been offered a position as Chief Marshal for the Southern District of Wyoming Territory. It would mean relocating to Cheyenne, where the federal court is based. The position offers better pay, more stability, and the chance to work within the larger judicial system rather than just one town. I've not yet given my answer, as the decision involves more than just professional considerations. Florence, I would be in Cheyenne near you and Sarah. Before I accept, I need to know if my presence there would be welcome, or if it would complicate your life in ways you don't desire. I have come to care for you more deeply than I can express in a letter. These months since Denver have only strengthened my feelings. If there is any chance that you might someday see a future for us together, I will accept the position without hesitation. If not, I will remain in Laramie and continue to value your friendship from a distance." Florence read the letter multiple times, her hands trembling slightly. The thought of Elliott in Cheyenne, of seeing him regularly, of potentially building a life together, it was everything she had secretly hoped for, but hadn't dared to expect. That evening, after the children were in bed and Sarah was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, Florence wrote her reply. "Dear Elliott, your news brings me more joy than I can properly convey. The thought of you in Cheyenne, of being able to see you regularly instead of merely reading your words on paper, fills me with hope and happiness. These past months have been a time of healing and growth for me. The shadows of my marriage to Frank have receded, replaced by the light of new possibilities. Sarah thrives in our new life, and I find fulfillment in my work with the Thayer children. Yet someone has been missing. You, Elliott. I have come to care for you deeply. Our meeting in Denver confirmed what I had begun to suspect from your letters, that you are a man of true character, compassion, and strength. A man unlike any I have known before. If your decision brings you to Cheyenne, know that you will be more than welcome in our lives. Sarah deserves to know the man who said she was perfect on the day of her birth. And I deserve the chance to discover if what I feel for you might grow into something lasting and true. With affection and hope, Florence." 2 weeks later, Florence received a telegram. Position accepted. Stop arriving Cheyenne May 15. Stop letter to follow. Stop with deepest affection. Elliott. True to his word, Elliott arrived in Cheyenne on May 15, 1876, taking up residence in quarters provided for the chief marshal near the federal courthouse. His first evening in town, he called at the governor's residence, hat in hand, asking formally to see Florence. Their reunion was filled with the awkwardness of new beginnings layered over established feelings. Under Mrs. Thayer's curious but approving eye, they sat in the formal parlor, making polite conversation about Elliott's journey and his new position. "Perhaps you might show Marshal Whitaker the gardens," Mrs. Thayer suggested after tea had been served. "They're particularly lovely this time of year." Outside, among the blooming spring flowers, their formality melted away. Elliott took Florence's hands in his eyes searching her face as if to memorize every detail. "I've missed you," he said simply. "And I you," Florence replied, squeezing his hands. I can hardly believe you're really here. I am, he assured her, and I have no intention of going anywhere. Over the following weeks, Elliott became a regular visitor at the governor's residence. He joined the family for Sunday dinners, accompanied Florence, Sarah, and the Thayer children on outings to the park, and gradually became a fixture in their lives. Sarah, now 13 months old and toddling uncertainly on chubby legs, took to Elliott immediately. The first time she held out her arms to him, demanding up. In her clear baby voice, Florence felt tears spring to her eyes at the beautiful simplicity of the connection. By August, the nature of Florence and Elliott's relationship was clear to everyone who knew them. They were frequently seen together in Cheyenne at church services, community events, or simply walking through town. Sarah perched on Elliott's shoulders while Florence walked beside them. Governor Thayer, who had initially been cautious about the budding romance given Florence's supposed widowhood, eventually took Elliott aside one evening after dinner. "Whitaker," the governor said, offering Elliott a cigar as they stood on the veranda, "I've come to respect you greatly these past months. Your work as chief marshal has been exemplary." "Thank you, sir," Elliott replied, accepting the cigar. "More importantly," the governor continued, lighting his own cigar, "I've observed your character, both professionally and in your interactions with Mrs. Sutton and her daughter." Elliott waited, sensing more was coming. "My wife is quite fond of Florence," the governor said, blowing a smoke ring. "Considers her almost a daughter. She would be most distressed if Florence were hurt in any way." "As would I, sir," Elliott assured him. "My intentions toward Mrs. Sutton are entirely honorable." The governor fixed Elliott with a penetrating stare. "I'm aware of Mrs. Sutton's true circumstances. My position requires me to know the backgrounds of those in my household." Elliott stiffened slightly. "Sir, Sheriff Davies of Laramie is an old friend. When Florence first came to us, I made inquiries. I know that Frank Sutton is very much alive, or at least was when he left Wyoming territory." Elliott remained silent, unsure how to respond. "Don't misunderstand me," the governor said. "I have no intention of revealing this information or causing Mrs. Sutton any distress. A woman in her situation deserves protection and a chance at happiness." He tapped ash from his cigar. "I simply want to be certain that you understand the full complexity of her position." "I do, sir," Elliott said firmly. "Better than most. I was the one who found her after Sutton's attack. I helped her escape." The governor nodded thoughtfully. "And now, what are your intentions now, Marshal?" Elliott met the older man's gaze directly. "To ask Florence to marry me, sir, to be a father to Sarah and to protect them both for as long as I live. And the legal complications, Frank Sutton is still legally her husband." "There are provisions in territorial law for abandonment," Elliott replied. "Given the circumstances and with proper legal representation, Florence could obtain a divorce without Sutton's cooperation." The governor smiled slightly. "You've researched the matter thoroughly, I see." "I've consulted with Judge Parker on the subject, hypothetically, of course." "Of course." The governor clapped Elliott on the shoulder. "Well then, Marshal, you have my blessing, for whatever that may be worth. Mrs. Sutton deserves happiness after what she's endured." "Thank you, sir," Elliott said, relief evident in his voice. "Your blessing means a great deal to both of us." 2 weeks later, on a perfect September evening, Elliott invited Florence for a buggy ride outside of town. Sarah remained at the governor's residence, happily playing with the Thayer children under Mrs. Thayer's watchful eye. Elliott drove them to a scenic overlook above Crow Creek, where the setting sun painted the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. He spread a blanket on the ground and unpacked a simple picnic bread, cheese, cold chicken, and a bottle of wine. As they ate and talked, watching the sun sink toward the horizon, Florence felt a profound contentment. The journey from her terrified escape from Laramie to this peaceful moment had been challenging but ultimately healing. When they had finished eating, Elliott took her hand, his expression suddenly serious. "Florence, there's something I've been wanting to ask you," her heart quickened. "Yes." "These past months in Cheyenne have been the happiest of my life. Being near you and Sarah, watching her grow, seeing your smile each day, it's more than I ever dared hope for." He reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. "I spoke with Governor Thayer about our situation. He assured me that with his influence and the right legal approach, your marriage to Frank could be legally dissolved on grounds of abandonment and cruelty." Florence's eyes widened. "He knows about Frank. He made inquiries when you first arrived," Elliott explained gently. "But he's kept your secret and supports your fresh start completely." Florence nodded slowly, processing this information. "What I'm trying to say, rather poorly," Elliott continued, opening the box to reveal a simple but elegant gold ring set with a small diamond, "is that I love you, Florence. I love Sarah as if she were my own daughter. And if you'll have me, once the legal matters are settled, I want to marry you. To be a husband to you and a father to Sarah and perhaps, God willing, to more children in the future." Tears filled Florence's eyes as Elliott dropped to one knee before her, the open ring box extended in his hand. "Florence Sutton, will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Florence whispered, then more firmly, "Yes, Elliott, I will marry you." With a smile that lit his entire face, Elliott slipped the ring onto her finger, then gathered her into his arms, kissing her with a tenderness that spoke volumes about the kind of husband he would be. As they held each other, the last rays of sunlight gilding the landscape around them, Florence felt a sense of rightness, of coming home after a long and difficult journey. With Elliott by her side, the future stretched before them, full of promise and possibility. The legal process of ending Florence's marriage to Frank Sutton proved less complicated than anticipated. With Governor Thayer's influence and Judge Parker's guidance, a divorce was granted on grounds of abandonment and cruelty, the proceedings kept as private as possible to protect Florence's reputation. Elliott and Florence were married in a small ceremony at the governor's residence on Christmas Eve, 1876. Sarah, now 18 months old, served as an unofficial flower girl, toddling down the aisle scattering rose petals with Mrs. Thayer's help. The Thayer children participated enthusiastically, with William proudly bearing the rings and Alina and James serving as attendants. After the wedding, Elliott, Florence, and Sarah moved into a comfortable house near the courthouse, purchased with Elliott's savings and Florence's carefully hoarded wages from her time with the Thayers. Though Florence had offered to continue as governess, Mrs. Thayer insisted that she focus on building her new life. "You'll have your hands full with a husband, a toddler, and establishing a home," Mrs. Thayer said warmly. "Besides, Alina has been begging to attend the new girls' academy in town. It's time for a change for all of us." The first year of their marriage was one of adjustment and deepening love. Elliott took to fatherhood with natural ease, spending evenings reading to Sarah, teaching her to identify birds and plants on weekend walks, and rocking her back to sleep after nightmares. Florence discovered the joy of a true partnership, of sharing decisions and burdens instead of bearing them alone. Elliott's respect for her intelligence and opinions healed wounds left by Frank's dismissive cruelty. In Elliott's presence, she bloomed like a flower long kept in darkness, suddenly exposed to sunlight. In November of 1877, Florence discovered she was expecting their first child. The news brought both joy and anxiety: joy at the expansion of their family, anxiety at memories of Frank's reaction to Sarah's birth. "What if it's another girl?" Florence asked one evening as they sat by the fire, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. Elliott looked up from his book, brow furrowed in confusion. "Then we'll have two perfect daughters," he said simply. Tears filled Florence's eyes. Elliott set aside his book and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "Florence, listen to me," he said gently. "Boy or girl, this child is a blessing. Just like Sarah is a blessing, I will love our baby regardless of whether we have a son or a daughter." "I know," Florence whispered. "It's just the memory of Frank's reaction. Sometimes it haunts me." Elliott's expression hardened briefly at the mention of Frank, then softened as he gazed at his wife. Frank Sutton was a fool who couldn't recognize the precious gifts right in front of him. "I'm not Frank, Florence, I never will be." "I know that," Florence assured him, squeezing his hands. "In my heart, I know it completely. It's just that sometimes old fears resurface." "Then I'll keep reminding you," Elliott promised, rising to place a gentle kiss on her forehead. "Every day if necessary." On June 15, 1878, Florence gave birth to a healthy baby boy whom they named James Elliott Whitaker. Sarah, now 2.5 years old, was fascinated by her little brother, constantly wanting to help feed him, rock him, or simply watch him sleep. "Mama, he's so tiny," she observed one afternoon, peering into the cradle where James slept. "Was I that tiny? You were even smaller," Florence told her, stroking Sarah's golden curls, "but you grew just as James will grow." Sarah considered this solemnly, then asked, "Did my first papa love me when I was tiny?" The question caught Florence off guard. They had never hidden from Sarah that Elliott was her stepfather, but they rarely spoke of Frank. "Why do you ask that, sweetheart?" Sarah shrugged. "Billy Thornton said his new mama doesn't love him like his real mama did. Made me wonder if my first papa loved me." Florence pulled Sarah onto her lap, choosing her words carefully. "Your first papa had a lot of troubles in his heart. He didn't know how to love people properly." She hugged Sarah close. "But that had nothing to do with you, my darling. You were perfect from the very beginning." "That's what Papa says," Sarah said, referring to Elliott. "He says I was perfect just like you." Florence smiled, remembering Elliott's words on the night of Sarah's birth. "Your papa is a very wise man." As James grew from infant to toddler, the Whitaker household expanded again with the arrival of twins, Catherine and Thomas, in the spring of 1880. The house on Pine Street, once spacious for a family of 3, now burst with activity and laughter. Elliott's career continued to flourish. In 1882, he was appointed federal marshal for the entire Wyoming Territory, a position of considerable responsibility and respect. Florence, while devoted to her growing family, also found time to engage with the community, serving on committees to establish Cheyenne's first public library and advocating for educational opportunities for girls. Sarah, now 7 years old, developed into a thoughtful, compassionate child with her mother's golden hair and a determination that sometimes reminded Florence uncomfortably of Frank. Unlike Frank's bullying nature, however, Sarah's determination manifested in positive ways, mastering difficult subjects at school, standing up for younger children against bullies, insisting on learning to ride horses despite falling numerous times. "She's going to change the world someday," Elliott remarked proudly one evening, watching Sarah teach 5-year-old James to read. "Our Sarah's got a fire in her spirit." "She does," Florence agreed, bouncing 2-year-old Catherine on her knee while Thomas played with blocks at her feet. "I only hope the world is ready for her." Life was not without its challenges. Elliott's position sometimes placed him in dangerous situations, pursuing outlaws across the territory's vast landscapes. Each time he rode out on such missions, Florence felt the cold grip of fear, knowing the risks he faced. In 1885, those fears nearly became reality when Elliott was shot during an attempt to apprehend a gang of bank robbers near the Colorado border. The bullet lodged in his shoulder, narrowly missing vital organs. Florence spent 3 agonizing days at his bedside in the Cheyenne hospital, praying for his recovery while their children stayed with the Thayers. "You can't leave us," she whispered to his unconscious form on the second night, holding his hand between both of hers. "We need you, Elliott, I need you." Whether it was her words, the doctor's care, or Elliott's own determination, he rallied on the 3rd day, fever breaking, strength slowly returning. His recovery took months, during which time Florence managed both the household and many of his professional responsibilities, taking notes and writing correspondence as he dictated from his sick. "I don't know what I'd do without you," Elliott told her one afternoon as she organized papers on the bed where he was propped against pillows. "You're the strongest woman I've ever known, Florence." "I learned strength from necessity," she replied, bending to kiss his forehead. "And from having someone believe in me when I didn't believe in myself." By the fall of 1885, Elliott had recovered enough to resume limited duties, though the injury left him with occasional pain and reduced mobility in his left arm. The experience prompted serious discussions about their future. "Maybe it's time to consider a change," Elliott suggested one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching their children play in the yard. "The territory's changing. Statehood is coming within a few years. There will be new opportunities, less dangerous ones." "What kind of change are you thinking of?" Florence asked, curious rather than concerned. Elliott smiled, taking her hand. "Judge Parker suggested I consider studying law. With my experience in law enforcement and his mentorship, I could be admitted to the bar without attending law school back east." "A lawyer," Florence considered the idea. "You'd be good at it. You've always had a strong sense of justice." "And eventually, perhaps, a judge," Elliott admitted. "It's something I've thought about for years, even back in Laramie." Florence squeezed his hand. "Then you should do it. We'll manage the transition together as we've managed everything else." With Florence's encouragement, Elliott began studying law under Judge Parker's guidance while continuing his reduced duties as federal marshal. The arrangement was demanding, requiring long hours of study after already full days of work, but Elliott approached the challenge with characteristic determination. Sarah, now 10 years old, took a keen interest in her father's studies, often sitting with him in the evening, asking questions about the legal principles he was learning. Her sharp mind and natural sense of fairness impressed both Elliott and Judge Parker. "That girl of yours could make a fine lawyer herself someday," the judge remarked after Sarah had participated in a particularly insightful discussion about water rights. "Shame the profession's not open to women." "Not yet," Elliott replied thoughtfully, "but things are changing. Wyoming's been at the forefront of women's rights from the beginning. Who knows what the future might hold?" In 1887, Elliott was admitted to the territorial bar, officially beginning his transition from law enforcement to legal practice. Governor Thayer, still a strong supporter of the Whitaker family, appointed Elliott as special counsel to the territorial government, a position that provided stable income during the transition while allowing him to build a private practice. That same year, Florence received a letter that reopened old wounds. It was from her sister in Missouri, informing her that Frank Sutton had died in a bar fight in St. Louis. "He came back to Missouri about 10 years ago," the letter explained. "Drank away what money he had, worked odd jobs when he could get them. Always talking about a wife who ran off with his daughter, though most folks thought he was just spinning tales. The funeral's next week. Thought you should know." Florence sat in the garden for a long time after reading the letter, emotions swirling within her. Relief, a touch of vindication, but also sadness for the wasted life, for the man Frank might have been if demons hadn't consumed him. When Elliott found her there, she wordlessly handed him the letter. He read it quickly, then sat beside her, taking her hand. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. Florence nodded slowly. "I think so. It's strange I haven't thought of him in years, not really. He has no power over me anymore." She looked at her husband. "But I find myself feeling sorry for him, sorry for the life he threw away." Elliott put his arm around her shoulders, drawing her close. "That's because you have a compassionate heart, Florence. It's one of the many reasons I love you." That evening, they gathered their children Sarah, now 12, James 9, and the twins Catherine and Thomas, 7, for a family discussion. Though Sarah knew Elliott was not her biological father, the younger children had never been told the full story of their family's beginning. With sensitivity appropriate to their ages, Florence and Elliott explained Sarah's birth, Frank's cruelty, and how Elliott had intervened that fateful night in Laramie. They spoke of Florence's journey to Cheyenne, their reunion in Denver, and eventual marriage. So Sarah has a different last name than us? James asked, trying to understand. My birth name was Sarah Sutton, Sarah explained to her younger siblings. But when Mama and Papa married, Papa adopted me legally, so my name is Sarah Whitaker now, just like yours. But your first Papa was a bad man, Catherine asked, her young face troubled. Elliott leaned forward, his expression serious. No one is all bad, Catherine. Mr. Sutton made very poor choices. He hurt your mother when he should have protected her, but everyone has good and bad inside them. What matters is the choices we make. Thomas, always the most reflective of the children, considered this. Is that why you became a marshal, Papa, to stop people from making bad choices? Elliott smiled gently. Partly. And now, as a lawyer, I try to help people understand the consequences of their choices, good or bad. I'm glad you made the choice to be our Papa, Sarah said quietly, rising to hug Elliott. Even though I wasn't your real daughter. Elliott held her close. Sarah Elizabeth Whitaker, you have been my real daughter from the moment I first saw you, just hours after you were born. Blood doesn't make a family. Love does. The years continued to pass, bringing changes both to the Whitaker family and to Wyoming. In 1890, Wyoming became the 44th state and the first to grant women full voting rights, a development that delighted Florence and inspired Sarah's growing interest in women's suffrage and legal rights. Sarah, at 15, was now a striking young woman with her mother's golden hair and delicate features, combined with a determination and eloquence that often reminded people of her adoptive father. Her academic achievements had placed her at the top of her class at Cheyenne's high school, and she spoke openly of her desire to attend college, perhaps even to study law someday. The University of Michigan has admitted women to their law school, she announced at dinner one evening in 1891, looking meaningfully at her parents. And several women have already been admitted to the bar in various states. Elliott and Florence exchanged glances, a silent communication developed over their years together. That's quite a distance from Wyoming, Elliott observed mildly, and quite expensive. I've been saving from my work at Judge Parker's office, Sarah replied. She had been serving as a part-time clerk for the judge for the past year, filing papers and organizing case materials. And I could apply for scholarships. We'll discuss it, Florence promised. You still have almost 3 years before college. There's time to make plans. Later that night, after the children were in bed, Florence and Elliott sat in their bedroom discussing Sarah's ambitions. She gets her determination from you, Elliott teased, pulling Florence into his arms. From me, Florence laughed. I think not, that's all you, counselor. Elliott grew serious. Whatever its source, we should support her, Florence. Sarah has a brilliant mind. She could make a real difference in the world if given the opportunity. I agree, Florence said softly. I just worry about her going so far from home, facing prejudice as a woman in a man's field. If anyone can handle it, Sarah can, Elliott assured her. And by then, James will be starting at the state university, so they could travel east together initially. Florence leaned her head against her husband's chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. When did our children get so grown up? It seems like yesterday that Sarah was that tiny baby in my arms, and now she's talking about law school. Time has a way of moving faster than we expect, Elliott agreed, stroking her hair, still golden though now threaded with silver. But what a blessing these years have been, Florence. What an incredible journey. Florence tilted her face up to his. Do you ever regret it? Taking on another man's wife and child that night in Laramie, Elliott's blue eyes, crinkled now at the corners from years of Wyoming sun and laughter, met hers with the same warmth they had shown on the night of Sarah's birth. Regret the best decision of my life? Never. He kissed her gently. Sarah was perfect just like her mother, and every day since then has only proven how right I was. In the spring of 1894, as Wyoming wildflowers painted the prairie in brilliant colors, the entire Whitaker family gathered on the platform of the Cheyenne train station. Sarah and James, now 19 and 16 respectively, were bound for the East Sarah to begin her studies at the University of Michigan Law School. James to visit Eastern universities before beginning his own college career the following year. "Write every week," Florence instructed, straightening Sarah's already immaculate travel coat, "and telegraph when you arrive safely." "We will, Mama," Sarah promised, embracing her mother tightly. "Don't worry so much." "That's like asking the sun not to rise," Elliott joked, though his own eyes betrayed emotion as he hugged his daughter. "We're proud of you, Sarah, both of you," he added, clapping James on the shoulder. The twins, now 14, took turns hugging their older siblings, extracting promises of gifts and letters filled with descriptions of eastern cities. As the train whistle blew, signaling imminent departure, Sarah took a moment alone with her parents. "I've been thinking about that night," she said quietly. "The night I was born, the night you saved us, Papa." Elliott and Florence exchanged surprised glances. "You've never really talked about it before," Florence observed. "I've always known the story," Sarah replied. "But lately, I've been thinking about what it means, about how different my life would have been without you, Papa, about the kind of strength it took for you, Mama, to leave everything behind for my sake." "For our sakes," Florence corrected gently. "Everything I did was as much for me as for you." "Still," Sarah persisted, "you both showed such courage. It's inspired me. When I become a lawyer, I want to help women in similar situations. Women who need protection, who need someone to say their children are perfect just as they are." Elliott cleared his throat, clearly moved. "You'll do great things, Sarah. I've known it since the day you were born." The final boarding call sounded. With one last round of hugs, Sarah and James boarded the train. As it pulled away from the station, Sarah leaned from the window, waving until the train rounded a bend and disappeared from view. Florence felt Elliott's arm slip around her waist as they stood watching the empty tracks. "She'll be fine," he murmured against her hair. "Our Sarah's stronger than both of us put together." "I know," Florence replied, leaning into his embrace. "It's just hard to let go." They turned away from the tracks, the twins running ahead of them toward the waiting buggy, their energy a reminder that the nest wasn't entirely empty yet. "Do you ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Florence asked as they walked. "If you hadn't come by the homestead that night," Elliott's arm tightened around her. "Sometimes. But then I remember that some things are meant to be, Florence. Some paths are meant to cross." Florence smiled up at her husband, the man who had seen perfection in a newborn girl when another saw only disappointment, who had recognized strength in a battered woman when she could barely see it in herself. "I believe you're right, Elliott Whitaker," she said, reaching up to brush a strand of silver-threaded brown hair from his forehead. "Some paths are indeed meant to cross." As they reached the buggy where the twins waited impatiently, the warm Wyoming sun bathed them in golden light, promising yet another beautiful day in the life they had built together, a life founded on a moment of courage, on words spoken in the darkness of a Laramie night nearly 20 years before. "She's perfect." Just like her mother,